As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace. A river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much, and there we were by its waters as peace came over the land. That's how Colombians feel about the Mother Magdalena. The river is Colombia. Colombia exists as a nation because of the river. Colombia is the gift of the Magdalena.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum. Today we are honoured to have with us both a stellar intellect and a remarkable human being, the world-renowned cultural anthropologist Wade Davis. Davis is joining us from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where he holds the leadership chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk. Wade has been described as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all of life's diversity. In recent years, his work has taken him to East Africa, Borneo, Nepal, Peru, Polynesia, Tibet, Mali, Benin, Togo, New Guinea, Australia, Colombia, Vanuatu, and Mongolia. He has trekked from the Amazon to the Arctic, leading a truly illustrious life, earning degrees in anthropology and biology and a PhD in ethnobotany, all from Harvard. In addition to writing 20 books, Davis has taken award-winning photographs, made documentary films, and explored people, plants, and places all over the planet. He was the National Geographic Explorer in Residence for more than a decade and became an honorary citizen of Colombia in 2018. Welcome to you, Wade. Your latest book that you've just finished, rather a large book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, is your love affair with Colombia. So most people's knowledge of Colombia is extremely limited, and it's, you know, some cartel drug soap that's on Netflix. And it's not your view, obviously. You must be very, very proud of the country, because otherwise you wouldn't be a citizen. So for the uninitiated, can you tell us how the love affair with Colombia began?
In moving to Colombia, the issue of drugs is front and center. Look, Colombia has suffered for 50 years of violent conflict that left 220,000, maybe 260,000, nobody really knows, dead, 7 million internally displaced. For a time, there was a kidnapping occurring every 3 hours of every day around the clock throughout the year. But always the Colombian people have been the innocent victims of a war caused exclusively by the flood of illicit money due to the cocaine trade. You know, at no point during the war, on all three sides, paramilitary, guerrilla, and military, were there more than 200, maybe 300,000 combatants in a country of 50 million. Most Colombians were innocent victims caught in a vice of war, individuals who had never seen, let alone used, cocaine. To give you a sense of the scale of it, at the height of the Medellin cartel, with the Americans spending up to $60 billion a year fighting their war on drugs, the Medellin cartel was putting 80 tons of cocaine into America every month, $70 million of profits every day. The accountants back in Medellin were budgeting $1,000 a week for the purchase of elastic bands just to wrap the illicit cash. In the last year before the final signing of the peace agreement in Cartagena in 2016, the FARC, the dominant leftist guerrilla group, down at that point to 6,000, maybe 8,000 cadre, mostly teenagers in search of a free meal, was nevertheless, through extortion and drug trafficking, most of it cocaine, generating $600 million a year. So if you give me the Beverly Hills Boy Scouts and $600 million, I can wreak havoc in Southern California. And you know, the reason this is so important is that as we reduce Colombia to caricature through series like Narcos, we are forgetting that we are the engine that has driven this nightmare. It is consumption of drugs in bars and bar rooms across America that has fueled the flames of war. How would Americans feel if Canada had patterns of drug consumption and laws that facilitated a black market trade, yet implementation of those laws that was so slack that the trade was never seriously impacted, such that 85 million Americans would be forced to flee their homes? Well, that's what happened in Colombia. And yet, despite that, through all those years of agony, Colombians maintained civil society and democracy, greened their cities, sought restitution with indigenous people unlike any other nation state on the planet, created millions of acres of national parks, and laid the foundation for an economic renaissance as young Colombians forced to flee the country because of the conflict are coming back equipped with skills in every conceivable vocation, coming home from every capital of the world. And people are within Colombia waking up to the fact that the richness of the country is in its natural beauty. The Colombia is geographically, ecologically, botanically the most rich country on earth. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecological niche to be found on the planet. Colombia is by no means a place of violence and drugs. It is a place of colores y cariño, where the people have managed to endure this horror because of the strength of character, because of their spirit of place, because of the immense generosity of heart that typifies the Colombian people. Look, at a time, just to put it in some kind of comparison, when Americans have been treating refugees at the Mexican frontier, refugees that are for the most part fleeing political chaos created by the interventions of the Americans in the 1980s during the zealous crusade against the left in countries like Guatemala and Nicaragua, and the chaos created today by the movement of cocaine through Central America as America has sealed off the Caribbean, and yet Americans continue to savor and delight and do anything they can to get their hands on this awful drug. We turn away mothers and put their children in cages, frankly, whereas the Colombians, who are faced in the wake of the peace agreement with a peace accord that has literally 500 or more clauses, the implementation of which will cost $45 billion at a time when oil prices have plummeted, and yet they've been managing to absorb not one, not a dozen, but 1.8 million desperate refugees from Venezuela who have not been turned away at the border. They've been welcomed, they've been housed, fed, the children have been schooled, the elders have been given medical care, everyone's been given food. This is the most extraordinary humanitarian gesture that any nation state has done in the Americas in my lifetime. And yet Colombians don't get credit for that. They continue to get pilloried by this cliche driven by our perception. My friend Sandra Uribe, who's a paisa from Medellin, grew up in Medellin at a time when by the time she was 15, she couldn't distinguish the sound of thunder from the sound of Escobar's bombs going off. And so the family sent her to live with her grandmother in Miami, and she was made fun of for being from the land of Escobar by high school students in Miami whose main social activity was the pursuit of drugs, with cocaine being their drug of choice. Sandra had never seen, let alone used, cocaine growing up in Medellin. And so the book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, takes the Mississippi of the river, the Magdalena, the river that flows south to north, the river that is both, like the Mississippi, a corridor of commerce, but it's also the fountain of culture, the source of poetry and literature and prayer and music. And it tells the story of the nation through the metaphor of the Magdalena Valley, which is home to 80% of Colombians and generates 80% of the national economy. And in a way, its sociology is serendipity. I traveled on 5 different journeys from the Macizo Colombiano, this rugged knot of mountains from which the Magdalena is born, and the three cordilleras of the country are born, all the way to the mouth where the fishermen live in shacks on a jetty, fishing by night with hooks that fly out in the ocean on kites, and they decorate their homes, their shacks with poetry. And it tells the whole story of the country through the people that I met. And I would just turn up in a village and wait until I met someone who had something powerful to say that I thought the world needed to hear, which, as Hemingway said, was the essence of storytelling. So in that sense, a friend of mine, Hector Abad, who's one of Colombia's great writers, and his book Oblivion is simply incredible. And it's an account of the assassination, of the wake of the killing of his father. In all the horror of Colombia over the last 50 years, there have been a handful of assassinations that have truly shaken the entire country. And the death of Hector's father, a social reformer, a physician, a benign, kind, lovely individual, did shake the nation. And Hector has been famously, as a prominent journalist and writer, known for his bitterness in the wake of that tragedy that has left him with almost a love-hate relationship with Colombia. So when he read Magdalena, and he wrote on the back of the book, only Wade and Magdalena could allow me to love my country again. That's really what the book is all about. It's kind of a love letter to a nation, and a nation that made my life possible. I first went to Colombia when I was 14 alone, when my mother told me that Spanish was a language of the future. I was with a small group of schoolboys, in fact, and they were all older than I was. I was just 14. And they were billeted with the wealthy families and spent a sweltering season in the streets of Cali, Colombia. And I, by contrast, was billeted with a more modest family in the mountains above the city at the edge of trails that reached west to the Pacific. And I never saw the other Canadian lads, many of whom succumbed to what the Colombians called mamitis, or homesickness. And I felt, by contrast, that I had finally found home. And so then I returned 6 years later, at the age of 20, as a young botanical explorer with a one-way ticket and a small pack of clothes and just 2 books, Lawrence's Taxonomy of Vascular Plants and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And I believe that bliss was an objective state that one could achieve just by opening yourself to the world. And both metaphorically and literally, I drank from any body of water, including tire tracks in the road. And I was always sick, but even that seemed to be part of it. Malarial fevers that would rise through the night and break with the dawn. Once, on a day's notice, I embarked on the traverse of the Darien Gap, 250 miles of swamp and rainforest, and became lost for 2 weeks with no food. And when finally emerged and got on a small plane for Panama City, I landed at the airport with only the ragged clothes on my back, all of which were saturated from vomit, which the passengers had thrown up all over me by accident, and $3 to my name, nowhere to go, but I had never felt more alive. And so Colombia really matched the intensity of my passions in a way that I've always felt that I owed something to the country. And in a way, Magdalena River of Dreams is a love letter to the country, but it's also a statement to the world that Colombia is on the edge of an extraordinary resurgence of hope. And that if we could clean up the Rio Magdalena, which is what everybody says, that would be the ultimate symbol that while the world may be falling apart, Colombia is falling together.
That's beautiful, beautiful metaphor. So how important was your poetry in terms of connecting with the people? Were you taken in easily, or did you have to prove yourself?
Well, because, the book I wrote, One River, which was translated by a Colombian poet and came out in 2002, a low point in Colombia's fortunes. And this was a book that recounted my travels with Tim Plowman, who was the protege of the legendary Harvard botanical explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushroom, so-called, in Mexico in 1938. And Schultes had found his life in Colombia. He had spent 12 uninterrupted years in the Northwest Amazon. Mountains bear his name, as do protected areas. He was, for his students, kind of a living link to the great naturalists of the 19th century. And so I wrote a book that was in part his biography. And you wouldn't think that a book like that would hit a nerve, but it came out at a time when not a decent word was being said about Colombia, and the nation was virtually a failed state. And suddenly there was a 700-page book that in its own way was less a love letter than a map of dreams for two generations of young Colombians who were not able to travel within their own country. So the
Oh,
book, unbeknownst to me, took off and became more than a cult book and a bestseller in the Spanish edition. It became a kind of an anchor of hope for people throughout the country in all walks of life. And it plus other things, that I've done have given me a kind of a very um, uh, influential position in Colombia that is far more influential than I deserve. But part of it is that we have to remember that the consequence of the view of Colombia for the last 50 years, think of the psychological impact on young people who have been taught to be ashamed of who they are, ridiculed. Look, Carolina Barco, the daughter of a former president, herself former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, at the time when she was Colombian ambassador to the United States of America, was strip searched at Dulles Airport simply because she had a Colombian passport. And when she objected and presented her diplomatic credentials, the customs person dismissed her with an obscenity, barked as if from the mouth of a dog. And so part of what El Rio did is it presented an image, a story, a portrait of Colombia absolutely in defiance of the false and dark cliches. I even was in Doha getting out of a shower in the business class lounge in Qatar when my cell phone rang some years ago, and it was Marta Ochoa, who was a sister of the three Ochoa brothers who were one half of the Medellin cartel, only one of whom, Fabio, is imprisoned in Georgia in a federal penitentiary. And Marta, whose kidnapping provoked the movement, Death to Kidnappers, that the cartel set in place, Marta was on the phone to ask me to go visit her brother Fabio in federal penitentiary in Georgia because the book had meant so much to him. I mean, it had that kind of impact. And so in Colombia, it's given me a voice, and it's an important voice, not a naive voice, but somebody has to stand up and hold the mirror to all that is good in Colombia. Magdalena by no means shies away from the dark moments in recent Colombian history, but it explains them in an empathetic way so people can come to understand what the motives are, what were people thinking, even as it sort of, celebrates what the river means to Colombians. Let me just read you, Mary, one short paragraph from Hermón Ferro, who is an incredible scholar, who is also the director of the one museum in the old colonial town of Honda, the one museum in the country strictly dedicated to the Rio Magdalena. And this is what he wrote to me. I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Rio Cauca and the Magdalena, and the Cauca is the other big arm of the Magdalena Valley. I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace. A river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much, and there we were by its waters as peace came over the land. That's how Colombians feel about the Mother Magdalena. Mm. The river is Colombia. Colombia exists as a nation because of the river. Colombia is the gift of the Magdalena.
It's a bit like the Ganges. It's holy.
Absolutely.
So somebody called Maria Clemencia Ramirez has written a question for you. What is your opinion on the peace accord?
Well, it's a complicated question, and it's a precarious piece. Look, in you have to go back in time. This conflict, which began on the left during the heady days of Che Guevara, and there were leftist movements everywhere in Latin America, and they were focused on legitimate political aspirations. Colombia was one of the few Latin American countries not to go through a process of land reform, for example, as Bolivia did in 1952, or Peru with decidedly mixed results in 1965. And yet, as the Soviet Union collapsed, and as those guerrilla movements became more and more corrosive, and as the war became more violent, because at the time the Colombian military was not strong, and the paramilitary movement on the right grew up as individuals ostensibly trying to defending their own lands from guerrilla groups that could come out of anywhere at any time. And since the paramilitaries saw that they could not be everywhere at all times, they had to have their presence somewhere at all times and everywhere at all times, and they settled on terror. So 80% of the most horrible murders were done by the paramilitaries, who became an open marauding force, the third leg of a stool of the Colombian War. And it was only, in a sense, when the DEA, which was seen as a police force dealing with drugs, and the CIA, which was seen as a political force dealing with the threat of communism, when the Americans kind of put that together in the concept of narco-terrorists, because with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1991, Cuba lost all of its support. And although there has been rhetorical support for the leftists, a number of groups, of which the ELN and the FARC were just two, rhetorical support from Ecuador and from Venezuela, very little material support. Sanctuaries, yes, but no real. So the guerrilla groups had to fund themselves. And they began by robbing the local agricultural banks, the Caja Guerrera in all the local towns. Then they turned to kidnapping and extortion. And then they found their way into the lucrative drug trade, not exactly what revolutionaries had in mind. But that's how before the final agreement was signed, FARC was making $600 million a year through illicit activities. Now, in 2002, the election of Alvaro Uribe, who was from the far right, in a gesture sort of like Nixon going to China, he was able to formally demilitarize the paramilitaries in 2006. It was a lenient arrangement because they weren't about to lay down their arms to march off into a prison. It was no perfect solution, but at least it removed them as an open marauding force. When Santos, who had been the defense minister for Uribe, became president and turned his energy toward peace, he negotiated the deal with the FARC, which again was a relatively lenient deal, only in the sense that the FARC weren't about to come in from the forest to march into a jail. Then he, in a sense, made the mistake of putting the agreement to a referendum, which he didn't have to do, but it was narrowly, very narrowly defeated. And that was an incredibly demoralizing step. And it was defeated because so many people had suffered, right? And are you jumping in, Mary, or?
I am, only because, I'm sorry to interrupt you, we've got another question I want to make sure we get.
Well, you want me to finish? I have to finish that question. It's very important. The key question today, Mary, is what's happened to the peace agreement. And so when the referendum failed barely, Santos went ahead and was able to move it legally through Congress, which nevertheless irritated those who had voted against the agreement. And he then was given the Nobel Prize for Peace. And then in the coming election, because constitutionally he could not run again, a man, Duque, from the right, a protege of Alvaro Uribe, was able to split a divided field and become president. But he became president on a platform that called for the revision, if not the elimination of the peace agreement, even though murder rates in Colombia had dropped in 1 year to levels not seen since 1975. Now, here's where it gets complicated. The federal state does not have the resources to get into all the lands that have been abandoned by the FARC. Why? Because the agreement itself has hundreds of clauses, implementation $45 billion, oil prices collapse, the Venezuelan refugee crisis is extraordinarily expensive, and at the helm of government is not someone who truly believes in the peace process. And in these areas, in the absence of a federal presence, all the cartels have reemerged. And again, the civil society lifting up its head only to have that head cut off by those who do not want a presence of the federal state in those remote areas. The thing that comes down again and again and again is cocaine. Until governments have the wisdom to eliminate the illicit trade through the cleansing stroke of legalization, it's very difficult to see how peace and stability in its totality can come to Colombia. And this is why this book has an important resonance for Americans, because this is not something happening in distant lands. There are today more people in more places using more cocaine than ever before. And everybody you know in America who uses cocaine, and the government that facilitates illicit trade but does nothing to stop the drugs coming into the country, everybody has the blood of Colombian people on their hands. And that's something we should be very cognizant of. We have to either legalize cocaine or stop the cocaine trade. And since the latter has proved to be impossible despite the expenditure of over $1 trillion and the mobilization of the entire military apparatus of the United States, the only solution is a legalization of a drug that is best compared to a drug used by your dentist to extract teeth. It's a horrible drug that comes from a plant known as the divine leaf of immortality. Let's get people using coca leaf, and let's leave cocaine hydrochloride as an anesthetic to the dentist.
Wow, that's quite a speech. Very good question that's just come in before we have to kind of wrap things up shortly. Harvard from David Lavelle. Harvard biologist Richard Schultz spoke at the forum in October '83 on how plants changed the world. How can America borrow some of the aspiration and hope that you describe are embedded in Colombia?
I don't quite understand the question. Plants are a source of hope. And what's the latter part of the question, Mary?
How can America borrow some of the aspiration and hope you describe are embedded?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, look, people ask me all the time if I'm optimistic. Well, I respond, of course I'm optimistic. I'm a father. Pessimism is an indulgence, despair an insult to the imagination, orthodoxy the enemy of invention. My father was not a Christian man, but he was a deeply ethical man, and he used to say that there's only one thing you need to know, son. There's good and evil in the world. Neither one is ever going to go away. So pick your side and get on with it. And we have this sort of idea in Christianity that eventually, the Christ child will defeat the fallen archangel, the devil, and we'll have some kind of, rapturous world of purity and goodness. And I don't really think that's ever going to happen. I don't think history suggests that's going to happen. And I tend to be more Buddhist in orientation, in the sense that, when Christians asked in the Middle Ages the obvious question, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil in the universe? To ask that was to commit heresy and to be burned at the stake. And yet in the East, when Lord Krishna was asked that very question by a disciple, Lord Krishna said, to thicken the plot. That's why evil exists in the universe. In other words, I don't see life as a destination, but rather as a path. I don't expect to win any battle. It's all about the process. Peter Matthewson, the great writer, said that anyone who thinks they can change the world is both wrong and dangerous. And he had in mind people like Mao and Hitler and Stalin. But I think, zealotry comes from those who think they've got the monopoly on the route to the divine, or the monopoly on the route to truth. I never believe that, but I do believe that there is right and wrong. And I don't think it's difficult to identify one from the other or distinguish one from the other. And so in all of my work, all of my 23 books have been driven by some sense of justice. You know, I mean, I hope that doesn't sound precious, but it's certainly my motivation. You know, I think Hemingway said that anyone who says that writing is easy is either a bad writer or a liar. I mean, it's hard to write books, and you have to stay motivated. And all of my books have had some wrong that I'm trying to right, and it's what drives me and keeps me going. And certainly in the case of Magdalena, River of Dreams, I just think it's sort of extraordinarily unfair that Colombia has borne the brunt of our drug obsessions, and that we've narrowly escaped any kind of almost exposure for, and yet they have suffered so extraordinarily, and it's just not right, and it's not fair. And you know, I think one of the things when you think of one of the supreme ironies of that is that cocaine is a very valuable topical anesthetic. You know, there's an adage of pharmacology: there's no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are good and bad ways of using drugs. And for nose, throat, and ear surgery, cocaine hydrochloride is wonderful. And similarly, you know, the coca leaf is the divine leaf of immortality. Now, the campesinos who are cutting down forests and growing coca are doing so because no other crop can compete. Coca yields 1,000 times any other crop. So they're going to grow coca. So it behooves us to create a legal nutraceutical market, not for cocaine, but for coca. And to compare coca with cocaine is like comparing potatoes and vodka. You know, when we, in the 1970s, Tim Plowman and Andrew Weil, as part of the project I was involved in at the Botanical Museum at Harvard, did the first nutritional study of coca. I mean, one of the ironies of coca is that the efforts to eradicate the fields began 50 years before there was ever a drug problem. As physicians in Lima looked up into the Andes and saw social pathologies, and because issues of illiteracy, poor nutrition, and because issues of economic distribution of wealth challenged too closely the bourgeois foundations of their lives in Lima, they settled on coca as a culprit for everything. And yet during all those years between the 1920s and 1975, nobody did a nutritional study of the plant. And had they done so, they would have discovered that the plant has a small, tiny amount of the alkaloid absorbed benignly in the mucous membrane of the mouth, analogous to the caffeine in a coffee bean. And yet it's also full of calcium, more than any other plant known to science, perfect for a diet that lacked a dairy product. It has a rack of vitamins, so that if you take your daily coca leaf consumption, that's all you need in terms of vitamins. It has enzymes that enhance abilities of the body to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, making it perfect for a potato-based diet of the Andean region. So, you know, one simple assay showed that this was a plant used with no evidence of addiction or toxicity by pre-Columbian peoples for over 4,000 years. So what we need to do is separate coca from cocaine and create a legal market for this incredibly benign, extraordinarily helpful stimulant, which is much milder than coffee or tea or chocolate even, but is incredibly more useful as a minor stimulant in our modern age. And so this is the kind of thing we can learn from traditional cultures, you know, in South America. You know, the purer the drug, the greater the potential for abuse. And so when you extract cocaine or morphine from the opium poppy, you run this terrible risk. The first morphine addict was the wife of the man who invented the hypodermic syringe. But coca, to equate coca with cocaine is to equate the luscious fruit of a peach with the cyanogenic prussic acid poison found within the pit of a peach. They're two different things altogether, and coca deserves to be celebrated, illicit cocaine condemned.
I think you've got another book there, Wade, coming, The Celebration of Coca. I can see it now. Yeah, it could be the salvation if we could shift that culturally, the perception, and make good on it for Colombia as an export. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story, Mary. When I came back from South America as a young scholar, Tim Plowman, my brother and mentor, told me there was a job at the USDA he wanted me to apply for, but if I took the job, he'd kill me. And I thought that was interesting. So I went out to Beltsville, Maryland, and I went into this office of this character who clearly was DEA, right? First thing I noticed about him is he was a drug addict. You couldn't get in the room for the cigarette smoke. Secondly, the walls were covered with seized paraphernalia. It was like going to the office of an anti-pornographer and having pornography on all the walls. And then I'm looking at this guy, and you know, it's 1970s, a big butterfly collar, gold chains around his neck, gold nuggets on his, I mean, you can't make this up. And what he wanted me to do for the job was to go, and all they had deduced from our incredible research, Tim's research, was that we were good at finding coca fields. So he wanted me to go back into the fields, secure the pests that predate on coca, bring them back, fungi, insects, whatever, to mutate them and breed them to be more pernicious so that I could reintroduce them to the coca fields. That's all he wanted me to do. And I thought, first of all, that's a little dangerous. And he put his claw into his chest and pulled out dog tabs inscribed with the agents who had been killed and everything. And I'm sitting looking at this guy and I'm thinking, where have I met you before? And it suddenly dawned on me that I had not literally met him, but I had met him 1,000 times in the streets of Medellin. He was the cartel. His vibe and energy and attitude was exactly like Carlos Leder, who later turned up, you know, he had a finca right above us and above the mountains in Rio Negro in Medellin. The point of this is that the people fighting the war on drugs are no different than the ones running the cocaine. They are two sides of exactly the same coin. Neither one of them has the slightest interest in winning the war on drugs. I mean, it's their gravy train. I mean, the US government spends billions of dollars a year. The Washington Post did an expose that showed that these billions of dollars spent every year, every part of the federal government, from the post office to the Boy Scouts, gets a part of the action. The thing we have to understand is that those in favor of the war on drugs don't want to win the war on drugs. And we should also understand that the war on drugs began as a cynical political gesture by Richard Nixon. Ehrlichman's books make it very clear that they couldn't care less about drug use in 1968. They saw it as a wedge issue. Blacks, civil rights, and hippies using drugs. That was a wedge issue that would allow them to galvanize the so-called silent majority, which they did very successfully. And the whole war on drugs has been an absolute fiasco. The bottom line is that you will never meet anyone, anywhere, anytime whose decision to use or not use drugs has anything to do with their illicit or legal status. There are no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are good and bad ways of using drugs. Coca is a good way to use coca. Cocaine hydrochloride is not a good way to use that magical plant. And if you legalize drugs tomorrow, you'd actually find out that drug consumption would plummet, because a huge part of what keeps the energy of the trade going is the very illicit nature of the trade, the amount of money that is involved in the trade. I can assure you that most Americans who want to use cocaine are using cocaine. Most Americans who don't use cocaine are not using cocaine because it's illegal. They're not using cocaine because they know it's stupid to use cocaine. And so legalization in every jurisdiction that has tried it has actually reported that drug use plummets. And so, you know, whatever the risks of legalization may be, the criminalization of drugs has given us crystal meth. It's given us stronger strains of marijuana. It's blurred the lines between pharmaceutical and illicit drugs, such that millions of Americans allowed themselves to get hooked on legally prescribed opiates that the pharmaceutical industry was peddling with every inch of its energy, to the point where 50%, you know, the greatest source of mortality for those under 50 in America is opiate use, a legal drug, you know. And the truth of the matter is that if you legalize drugs tomorrow, you would destroy the criminal element. And that should be our top priority. And that's, in a sense, an obligation that I feel both America and Canada, but the entire world has to Colombia. It is simply not right that Colombia is born and continues to bear the consequences of this ill-conceived crusade that has had 50 years of failure to its credit?
Well, we've covered a huge amount of territory today, Wade. I'm very grateful for your comprehensive worldview on so many things, both from the inside and from the kind of macro perspective. And this falling together, you say, that the Colombians are doing, I hope we can take a page out of their book as we go towards this election, and perhaps we can fall together sufficiently to change our direction. So I'm going to thank everybody for taking part, thanking Wade first, in today's Cambridge Forum with world-renowned cultural anthropologist, author and explorer Wade Davis, who has been described as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all of life's diversity. He joined us today from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where he holds the leadership chair in cultures and ecosystems at risk. So thanks everyone for your support. I will see you all in 2 weeks. Goodbye for now.